Good evening, Saints in Christ. Today we continue our study in Nehemiah, and today we want to look at Nehemiah 4, verses 1 to 14. This particular text is going to tell you about the opposition to the work and how Nehemiah responded to that opposition. Again, this is a good example for leaders, but of course, for each of us in our personal lives. Now, here goes. We start with verse 1. It reads, Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heap of rubbish and burn ones at that? So clearly, as you read this, you see it's criticism. Let's see what it is. First, we find here the external opposition. There's going to be an internal opposition, which we'll speak to later on. Verses 1 and 2 talks about the attack of Sanballat. And the first thing we realize is that he was filled with anger and rage just because the work of God was going on, just because the people were continuing to work. I guess he didn't think that they would do that. And let me tell you something. Every single time you are doing work, especially work as it relates to work for God, the devil is going to try to put a halt to it. First thing Sanballat come with is that he tried to get in their head. And so he was, apart from being angry, he had a verbal onslaught. First thing he did was jeer them. That didn't stop them. And then he publicly ridiculed them. He ridiculed them before all the people were there. He was trying to make it seem as if they had no sense. And so in the presence of his brothers and the army of Samaria, he ridiculed them. He kind of just went on a rampage in the public to try to get them to deter them from going on. And I want to tell you that sometimes that's going to happen. And what this text teaches us more than anything else is how we respond, because there are different kinds of opposition. And then notice he had a personal attack on them. First, he called them these feeble Jews, which seemed to suggest that there's a racial issue going on here. And interestingly, right now in our world, there is this outcry against racism, and he had a racial attack on them. And we all know persons can be cruel, and they try to find whatever they can to get you upset, to get you down. And so he called them these feeble Jews, these fufu, these weak Jews. Notice in this comment he also said that they were unskilled. Will they be able to do the job? Can they really do it? And then he says, will they sacrifice? Now that's a very interesting part of the text, because what it really refers to is that will they seek help from their God? Will they sacrifice their God, call upon him for him to come to help them? You would have remembered when there was no rain, if you know the story of Elijah, and the people sacrificed, the Baal worshippers sacrificed their God all day, cut themselves, but nothing happened. And then we find Elijah, who made a sacrifice, called unto God, and immediately rain came. So in the same vein, he's saying, will they get some help from their God? Because they are feeble Jews, they can't do anything. They're not going to be able to do this. Then he says, will they be able to endure the rigor? If you notice, he says, will they finish up in a day? So what he's saying is that these guys not going to be able to survive. They are not going to be able to survive. And then he looked at them and he said, they are incompetent. Do they have the competence? How are they going to be able to look at the bricks that are broken and see whether what is able to be used again? He really did not give them the credit in terms of their competence to do this job. And so here we have a personal attack. It was racial. It was like, you are novices. It was, you better let God help you. And he really just went to town and ridiculed them. I wonder what is your response when people ridicule you. We're going to see in a minute the response of Nehemiah. Then in chapter 3, in verse 3, we have Tobiah. You remember him? Sanballat's friend. Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him. And he said, now notice, so he's standing there. He's hearing the ridicule and the jeering of Sanballat. and he decided to join the party. And so hear what he said. Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it will break down their stone wall. So the attack of Tobiah is, this is inferior work. This work not going anywhere. Even if them finish the wall, then in a very short time, the wall is going to tumble down. It can't hold up. It can't stand. Sometimes in our interaction with people, they try to put us down. And like Tobiah, they try to say that you are incapable, you are incompetent, you are inferior. All of this have come into these three verses from these two men as they look at the work that was going on. But really what was happening is that they were angry that the work was going on, and they were venting their anger in these kind of ways. You are going to come up with people like that who are going to attack you, especially when you're doing the work of the Lord. The enemy of our souls is not going to let you just do a work that's peaceful. He's going to attack you. Now, when we read in the New Testament is very clear that vengeance belongs to the Lord, and we should leave it to the Lord to retaliate. Here is how Nehemiah responded. I'm going to read verses 4 and 5, and it reads, Hear, our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. Now, when you listen to this prayer, Nehemiah's trump card is that the ridicule is not just about us, but it is also ridiculing God. And because he sees it as an attack not just on them, but an attack on God, his prayer is a prayer for God to act. Now, technically we would say this is a imprecatory prayer, which means in Jamaican terms, you pray God for them. But the reality is, if you look to the structure of this prayer, you'll see that even though Nehemiah is asking God to visit them, he's still leaving it for God to do. Many times we will pray and we'll pray for the destruction of others and we don't have any option. But listen to this prayer as we go through the prayer. Let's see. The response of Nehemiah to during his prayer. Now, of course, you have to be a person who has some control to sit there and take all the insults and go to prayer rather than to respond. Most of us would respond when we have an attack like that. Most of us would respond in matching them verbally. Here's what the text is saying. You don't need to do that. What Nehemiah does, though, is that he poured out his anger before God. It's not to the men that he poured the anger, but before God. And he's asking some strong things of God. But it is before God. It is not a retaliation that goes directly to the people. What he does is that he goes to God. And I want us to learn that. That's not easy for us to learn. It's not easy for us to learn that in the midst of an attack, what is most important is that we don't lose the focus that God is with us and that God is the one who is awesome and able to do all things. Now, look at the address. He says, the address is very interesting. He says, Hear, O our God. So the first thing he established here is the address is personal and he seeks God's attention. Hear, O our God. He goes to God and he says, You are our God. And therefore it gives him the right to come into the presence of God and to ask God to listen to him. So he gets God's attention. Then he says, this is a situation. We, God included, are despised. Here we are doing your work, and some people have come along to despise us. Now, if you remember in the New Testament, as the men went about from city to city, Paul and the other apostles, they were attacked. And one of the things that Jesus did say, he said, as long as you live godly, you will suffer persecution. In fact, Paul himself was saved on the Damascus road while he persecuted the Christians. Think it not strange then, if you are a Christian and you are working for God, that you are going to be attacked by the enemy through persons. Here is Nehemiah's request in the prayer. First we see the address, and now we see the request. Well, we saw the situation, we see the address, and now we see the request. Four things. First thing he says, turn back their taunts. Now you have to remember Nehemiah is in the Old Testament times, and basically what he's doing is saying, the way they have taunt me, let the taunt come back upon them. It's an eye for eye situation in the time when Nehemiah lived. There is no grace like the New Testament. But hear what he says. He says, give them captivity. Now, to understand that is to say, let them be in a similar position so they can feel what we are feeling as captives. Of course, Nehemiah himself was not a captive, but the people who he was there working with had been captives. And he's saying, part of the problem with them is that they don't understand the disgrace we feel as captives. And therefore, give them the experience of being a captive. Let them feel firsthand what it is like. And then he says, don't forgive them though. And he says, don't forget their actions, because they have disgraced you, God, publicly. Now, if you remember, the whole platform of the work is that God is on our side, God has opened the doors, God is going to help us. So if God is behind the work, if God is the one who have opened the heart of the king, if God is the one who have opened the place for them to get the material, the permission, the protection, and then here it is, the motivation of the people came as a result of Nehemiah saying to them, God is on our side. And they are now working for God. So all that they are doing, the focus is bringing honor to God, coming out of this disgraceful situation and bringing honor to God. And these men come to ridicule them. So that the ridicule is not so much just to Nehemiah and his friends, but the ridicule is also a ridicule of God and what God had caused to happen. Now, I want to say to us is that we have to always remember when we are doing the work of God, there is going to be an attack. Don't take up that fight personally. Give God the opportunity to fight for you. Nehemiah spoke his heart, and there are some strong words in there, but Nehemiah is not retaliating right now to the verbal abuse. What Nehemiah is doing is that he's saying, God, this is your fight. You need to take this fight. And then guess what happened? Verse 6 says, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. And this is just wonderful, because in verse 6 we realize the work continued. This opposition did not stop the work. Sometimes when we are doing very well for God, and we are moving along, and somebody comes along with a verbal attack, guess what happened? We stop the work. Progress is not made, and the devil is able to successfully deter us from a job that needs to be done. Now, we have to learn, as Nehemiah did, that we cannot allow the work to stop. God has given us a work. In the New Testament, when the people of God was working for him, they were attacked. But the attack did not stop them. You remember them being in prison, and then they were singing, and God would open the door. And you have to know that the devil will not stop. He will always attack you if you are doing the work of God. And you must know how to respond. And here we have in Nehemiah a good response to the verbal attack. In verse 7 we read, but when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Hashodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. So notice the verbal attacks failed to halt the work. And because they tried that and it didn't work, they were going to come again. So in verse 8 it says, and they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So verbal attack don't work. So what they do is move to physical attack. Well, they didn't actually go there yet, but the plan was, okay, all right, they won't stop. We're going to stop them. We're going to go there and we're going to fight against them. We're going to take them on. And we find that in verse 8 we have the plot for a physical attack. And guess what Nehemiah did? Verse 9 says, "And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night." That didn't stop them. When the news reached them that there might be a physical attack, the first response again is prayer. And we have to learn that every single time there's a difficulty of whatever nature, of whatever magnitude, the first response must be that we turn to our God. But notice this time, it is not just prayer. The strategy this time includes a practical defense plan. So what they did was set a guard as a protection. So they prayed and then they work out a practical response. You know, sometimes God allows situations upon us, and prayer is first. Now, I don't know for sure, but I believe that in that prayer, God responded to them to say, set a guard. In the Old Testament, all along you see various wars, the people of God is always able to defend themselves with the sword. That's part of the Old Testament. And here we have Nehemiah prayed, but he was now putting in some practical measures that if the men came, they would defend themselves. Verse 10 through to 12 then gives a spin on the ball. In Judea it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So here we have some teachers. What we find in these three verses, verses 10 to 12, is internal opposition now. And why is this internal thing happening? It's because the people are losing heart. Notice what it says. The strength of those who bear the burden is failing. So there's too much rubble. So you find there's a complaint now. Now, if you think about it, even though they had attacked them verbally, they had continued to work. Now the men are stepping up the pressure. And this now, of course, among them would be some persons who are not as strong. And these weaker persons now, I think, begin to feel the pressure that was coming on, and they were losing heart. You know, in every group we have, there's going to be some who don't have the same courage as others. And there's a sense in which they don't have that courage. They can come now from the inside and start to give the sounds that would prevent the people from going on. So they were complaining now. They were now taking up the same things the men had said. Will they know what rubble to throw out? Will they know? Do they have the competence? And here they are saying they are feeling the feeling of inadequacy came upon them. This is too much rubble. This is too much things for us to work through. But I think the thing that really got them was the fear of the physical attack. I don't know that they believed that they were, well, some didn't believe that they would be able to match these men, even though God was on their side. And so here it is, they were saying 10 times they came and they said, all those who lived near, who weren't in Jerusalem, but they were in the villages nearby, who had come up and had a mind to work, their family came and said to them, come, we don't want nothing to you. We don't want anything to happen to you. Come home. Don't expose yourself to the possible attack. And so the opposition and the internal opposition came. Now, what we have then is Nehemiah again showing himself to be a master leader as he led the people through this. Let's read verses 13 and 14. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, and to the officials, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So here we have again now the strategy of Nehemiah. He really was a leader that was of keen interest. Surely he was a man walking with God and listening to God for wisdom as to how to go about. The first thing he did, he placed them in clans. He says, all right, let us put ourselves in groups so that no one person is there for them to attack. That's the first thing. So he grouped them. He grouped them in forces that they could retaliate. Later on in the book, you're going to learn another strategy from him. The second thing he did, he made sure they had the weapons that they needed so that if there was physical attack, they could defend themselves. So he organized them in groups, in clans, or if you prefer the text, in families. Then he armed them with the weapons they needed. And then he encouraged them. He encouraged them with the word. And he reminded them that God is awesome. I don't know if he probably told them the story of Egypt again. I don't know which of the story, the one at Jordan. Don't know if he told them the story of David and Goliath. But somewhere in there, he reminded them that God is awesome. You know, that's one of the things we need to always remember. When there is doubt coming in, when doubt is arising in our hearts, when we start to feel timid on the inside, when the threat seems like it's real and we don't think we can match the threat, we have to remember that God is an awesome God and God is on our side. And so what he did, he encouraged them and he reminded them of who God is and the fact that God was with them and on their side. And then he gave them a very good reason to fight. You see, he says you have to fight for your family. And that's where he did. He put them in clan. You don't want anybody coming here and attack you, attack your family. You have to fight for your family. And that was enough reason to give them the urge to realize that they would have to stand up and fight. Don't back down. Don't back down. You have good reason to defend. You can't allow people to come in and just destroy your family. So here we have in these 14 verses, Nehemiah's approach to opposition. First of all, when the external opposition was an opposition that was a taunt, Nehemiah went to God and talked about the taunt. When they upgraded the opposition and planned to come with physical force, Nehemiah again prayed, but at this time he also put a practical solution in it. But we must remember that sometimes when there's external pressure, it affects those on the inside. And so we saw the people on the inside now getting a little, what we'd say, a little bummy. They were uncertain. And their family members who were okay with them working before now comes and try to get them to stop working because they're afraid that something is going to happen to them. Notice Nehemiah's strategy is to say to them, listen, we can do this. First, he placed them in groups so that there would be no single person for them to attack. They would have to attack a group. He made sure they had the weapons that they needed to defend themselves. And then he encouraged them and he reminded them of who the Lord is. How awesome he is. I want to say that for us who are God's people, we have to learn to help persons along the way. We are talking about a group of people in this case on a project. But sometimes there's going to be an individual in the church, an individual that is going to find the pressure from outside a lot. You have to be able to help them so that they don't buckle under the pressure. You have to be able to remind them that God is able and that God is not going to leave them. You have to help them to believe God and believe the word of God. That when he says, I will never leave you alone, he means just that. You have to help them to see the practical ways in which they can deal with the situation. And I say to you, give them a good reason to stand up for God. We have to learn as we close this study. If we go back to the beginning, one of the things that we need to rebuild is rebuild the moral fiber of our society. And too many of us as Christians and citizens in general are bowing to the pressure that people bring upon us that really goes against our personal standards. And people want to tell us that if we stand for something, we are haters, but it's okay for them to stand for what they stand for, and we don't have the right to stand. Let me remind you that if you stand for the biblical principles, you are sure God is going to stand with you. Don't back down, don't run away. Call to God for strength and stand on God's word, and I guarantee you, God will be there to help you. God bless you.